provoke those around him. It was in this very room where Albert Koch and Mark Womble were 2 steps away, just this close to a fist fight over the issues that Blaine was engaged with at the time of the design proposal. We'll see if they deny that. Blaine is a licensed architect. He's practiced in Houston, Seattle, and Tokyo, and was the recent recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship in Japan, where he was studying contemporary Japanese material innovations. His writings have been published extensively, Popular Science, New York Times, Architectural Record, Business Week, just to name a few. And he's perhaps most well known for authoring Transmaterial, a catalog of materials that redefine our physical environment, as well as Transmaterial 2, and from what I understand, the forthcoming Transmaterial 3 out in 2010. And these publications assemble a collection of the numerous and diverse new materials and material assemblies that have been and continue to make their way to the market at an accelerated pace, particularly in the past 10 to 15 years, I would say. And many of these materials don't have a clear application relative to current building practices. So Blaine is cataloging this collection in a very straightforward, insightful way that emphasizes processes and performance characteristics of materials. He writes and lectures about the potentials in the future for the built environment and how they're reshaping aspects of practice today. I suspect that many of you are subscribers to Blaine's or Trans Studio's Product of the Week email distribution. As the name suggests, this is a weekly highlight and description of a new innovative material product. And one might imagine that this subscription is a byproduct of the Trans Materials publication, but in fact, Product of the Week was started over 10 years ago when Blaine shifted from graduate school into professional practice here in Houston. In the context of practice, he had to familiarize himself with building materials, something obvious and a given for architects to be knowledgeable about. But Blaine became very interested in more obscure or less defined materials that were starting to emerge, those outside the conventions of practice at the time on the fringe. So while working, designing, getting to build, essentially becoming an accomplished architect and practitioner, he began an independent trajectory or a project, this weekly email that he shared with friends and colleagues and eventually began to invite others to participate. So this was a modest project that he diligently maintained outside of his professional practice, but really had an impact on his work. And as he continued to practice in Seattle, later the project gained wider, more national distribution, and as you can imagine, after several years, became a significant resource and body of research. And Blaine was not only cataloging, but now writing and lecturing with a great deal of expertise about material innovation. So it's a simple concept or a simple notion, but a compelling one, particularly in Blaine's case, for operating in parallel trajectories and maintaining multiple dimensions of one's creative practice. Blaine has been and continues to be a significant voice for posing critical questions that surround this accelerated inundation of materials we're confronted with and their future potential in the built environment. So please join me in welcoming Blaine Brownell.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Don. That's quite a nice and thorough introduction. I don't know if I can live up to that. But before I begin, I'd just like to say that I've been a huge fan of both Albert and Mark. And despite the comment about the conflict there. I also have to say, before I begin, that it's wonderful to be back. It's been about just over a decade. It's been about 10 years since I left Houston and 11 years since I graduated from here, just math. It's really nice to be back. It's nice. I forgot what kind of atmospheric quality that Houston has, the dappled light and the live oaks. And anyway, you forget these things. They I'll brush it back to you. I also want to say, before I begin talking about the themes that Dawn alluded to, that credit really needs to be given where it's due. And I really believe that if it weren't for Mark Womble and Will Kennedy, with whom I worked after graduating from this institution, that I probably wouldn't have done any of this research. We were working on the Jones Plaza renovation at the time, right after I graduated, and they gave me the fortunate but also difficult for me position of researching materials for that project. And it really exposed, to me, it brought home the realities of my ignorance about materials, but also opened up a lot of doors in terms of material possibilities. So, having said that, can you see the screen? Well, I'd like to start, actually, not with an introduction, but more of a prologue, if that makes any sense. And this is a multi-course dinner, let's say. This is more like an appetizer, just to kind of set the stage and trigger your thinking about the ensuing issues that I'll talk about. So, I've become enamored with and interested in this term, disruptive technology. And this term came about in, I think it was the late 90s, and it was associated more with business marketing. It had to do with kind of leapfrogging technologies that brought new performance qualities in the marketplace and were cost-effective enough that they essentially traded places with existing technology. They were highly competitive. Okay, all that aside, I'm really interested in taking this notion and expanding it further. So you can see I'm interested in something I call disruptive applications, because all these new materials that have come across our desks, our computer screens, are really intriguing, and they bring tremendous possibilities. But what the lessons that I don't know if I've learned the lessons, but kind of themes I've been thinking about are, what does it really mean? What can these materials do, and what has material innovation done for architecture? How is material innovation related to the advancement of architecture as a project? And so, because we know to some extent that technology has become incorporated into architecture that wouldn't otherwise have been, right? But we also know that architecture exerts forces back into technology and into society. So I'll just a couple examples. Again, this is just to kind of set the stage for thinking about materials. So really basic and simple. Let's take glass. I often talk about glass because it's amazing to think of a time before window glass was the kind of obvious choice for apertures in buildings, right? So this is a sample of Roman window glass on the left. Started being used about 180 in significant buildings in Rome. It's hard to imagine a time before window glass. So this is an example of a material that at that time was disruptive. Of course, it took many centuries to really evolve and become a common material that we use, but it's disruptive in the sense that it became a commonplace material, replaced the predecessors. On the right, we have an example of a piece of architecture that used the same material, but not because it was the most innovative use of that material at the time, but rather as a form of social critique or making a cultural statement. The fact that, I imagine if I lived at the time that the glass house was built, it probably would have been quite shocking to think about the way that the domestic realm has been exposed to public scrutiny, or at least the message that's brought forward. And so there's a way that architecture not only benefits from new material technologies, but also uses them as a form of artistic or cultural critique or statement. So again, some really basic examples, but we're just trying to kind of parse how materials are used and how they advance architecture. So on the left, the wood stud, maybe a lot of these prosaic examples now, common examples, but at the time, much allowed for much lighter weight framing and more expedient framing and house can be framed in a shorter period than heavy timber, let's say. But what about So Fujimoto's wooden house here? I think the interesting thing about that is that this material, if we're looking at wood, this material is not, or the use is not necessarily about the most innovative form of the most sort of the newest wood product, let's say, and its application, but rather it's a utilization of a product that we've grown accustomed to in, let's see, cabin architecture. This is a remote cabin set, a remote setting in the woods, but also, let's say, the kind of domestic construction, let's say stairs, cabinetry, furniture. And there's an essay here about how all those different forms of wood construction, in a sense, of fabrication, come together in this building that for him is intended to be a kind of essay about free section. Although one could argue how free is a section if you want your head. But with that aside, I think it's a really incredible work in terms of how it uses a material, a simple material, but really disrupts maybe our sensibilities about how it should be used. So new materials also, new technologies often take hold and allow opportunities where there are challenges. So let's say, let's talk about the common one that always comes up is the intersection between, or let's say the combination of the steel frame and the elevator to allow the possibility of tall buildings. And we see the cathedrals of commerce and North Chicago, et cetera, and the rest is history. That obviously allowed for many floors to be built on small pockets of land. So there's a kind of challenge in that sense of how to maximize the value of the land that is afforded by the technology. And then we also see, so again, to kind of take another spin, looking at commercial architecture in this case, is how architects have been able to think about social trends and views of their time. And in this case, looking at Wright, Wisconsin Wax headquarters, thinking about the kind of birth of the modern corporation and this idea of embracing this notion of relatively more democratic, open office space, kind of the new sort of groundwork for modern commerce. So there's a kind of celebration and obviously and kind of an embrace of technologies that would allow that to come to being. So material effects obviously play a huge part in how architecture evolves and expresses itself. Okay, a long-winded prologue, but I'd like to talk about our current time and our current challenges and also opportunities and how they might influence how we use today's materials, how we might make architecture. So I'd like to look at a few thresholds, and incidentally, again, since it's been about a decade since I was here, a lot has changed. In fact, and this may sound a little bit old to me now, but I'll just pick a technology. So I saw in this room the very first projection of a digital presentation. It was given by Mark Mack, and it was, I think the resolution was like 640 by 480 or something on a really huge projector. It was cutting edge, right? But think about it. I mean, like that was the first and only presentation like this that I had seen. Before that, it was all slide-based and always comparative, etc. So a lot has changed, and architecture faces a lot of new changes as well. Not obviously really that one, but a lot of pretty stunning changes and new challenges. So one of which, and it's hard to know exactly what this means, but one of which has to do with the fact that we now live in an urban planet, and so far as you could say, having more than half the world's population living in cities could reinforce that point. But it's also amazing the extent to which urban migrations have occurred in a lot of parts of the world, and all the new infrastructure, all the pressures on new systems, predictions of future volumes of building are pretty stunning. Obviously, this is Tokyo, and actually, doesn't really matter, but for a year, we lived in here somewhere. Kind of hard to see, but I think coming to terms with the sheer volume of building and urbanization in other parts of the world is really something important to assess. The second kind of threshold I'd like to talk about is that many critics have started to view nature in a new way. Say that the kind of distinction that we've always made between the artificial, so-called artificial or man-made, human-made, and natural worlds there's really not a distinction. It's really an artificial distinction or a myth. And nature is now really pretty fully controlled or manipulated, I should say, by human forces, right? Even if we set aside land for a national park, something we're sort of manipulating that boundary, that territory, and maintaining that thing. So nature is something that isn't this other, right? It's something that we've begun to come to terms with. It's really one and the same thing. Another threshold I'd like to talk about, and all of these kind of thresholds, and later I'll talk about interdependencies, I hope help kind of frame the thinking about new materials and what they mean. So this is a really interesting, and I can say it's kind of a stunning development. And I'll speak about this in general terms, but we may face a situation where we have what we might call a peak generation. In the sense that during our lifetimes, we may see the peaking of oil and natural gas and minerals. Water's kind of another issue, but essentially what we're looking at is resource depletion on a pretty grand scale. I know China just surpassed us in its use of steel, and it's amazing the extent to which resources are being consumed around the world. We know about just, for example, the kind of water wars going on in the southeast of the country. I know there are many western states looking at the Great Lakes with hungry eyes, for example, because fresh water supplies are becoming really valuable. Minerals, I was shocked to understand that we only had about 70 years, or maybe even less, before we run out of easy, sort of kind of a low-hanging fruit, easily obtained supplies of bauxite to make aluminum. There's several other minerals. So it's really an economic proposition, so that it'll be cheaper to recycle, actually, eventually, than it will be ever to mine virgin materials like these. Okay, another threshold. This has sort of been my role the last few years, and I feel like a kid in a candy store kind of swimming in this stuff, because, and I think that there are many tools that brought about the kind of awareness of new materials development. You've probably heard statistics like James Timberlake talks about how more new materials are available for building now than they were in the last 15 years in a previous history of architecture. There's been a real explosion. I think a lot of it's been facilitated by the web and simply by enhanced communication, that we're simply more aware of the materials we have at our disposal. But it's really been a kind of an important and also impressive change also in our discipline, to see a lot more attention go to the new and unusual and hopefully more testing and evolving materials in practice than reaching into a drawer for the old brick detail, right? Nothing against brick, but just practice was a lot simpler in terms of the palette previously. It was conceived much more simply, I think, in terms of materiality when I first graduated than it is today. Another important threshold, green goes mainstream. And this is really important. It may be old news by now, but it wasn't that long ago when there were environmentalists kind of screaming from the sidelines that we could do something, and it really wasn't in the news too much. And then we reached a period where people started asking those same environmentalists, so what do we do? I feel like there's this kind of pause, a moment of recognition that, oh, we need to do something. So now, of course, what came with this? Well, all kinds of greenwash and jumping on a bandwagon and checking off boxes and scorecards and some silliness in terms of directing, the whole kind of biofuel debacle. Nothing against being an environmentalist, but we've stumbled and made some mistakes. And I think, the important point I want to make is that now the general public, whatever that is, has the attention of those wanting to do great design. It's an interesting time. Okay, another set of changes that I'd like to focus our attention to have to do with these kind of oppositions, which also are interdependencies. So, for example, world markets began to stumble a couple of years ago, and I remember reading, I can't remember exactly when, but I remember reading some Asian markets were claiming to be immune from whatever happened in this part of the world. Well, guess what? It's actually a much more interdependent geoeconomic climate than I think that many people realized it was. Another interesting trend of opposition here is that many experts think that we are moving from a hydrocarbon era to a carbohydrate-based era. From an era where we harness fossil fuels that have been stored for a long period to one kind of one-time resource to one where we're growing. And this is pretty obvious stuff at this point, but I think it's interesting, that shift, because it's put into play all kinds of new forces and thinking about new territories. I even heard last year we had a forestry expert come in and say there's some talk about growing and harvesting forests on some new massive scale of crops to provide fuel for the future. Speaking of which, I alluded to this earlier, this great idea, nothing against biofuels, but this great idea to look for a solution in corn, which, and I remember I actually spoke with Lester Brown a couple years back when this was happening. In Iowa, it pledged more supplies for biofuels than were grown as food crops in that state. And they grow a lot. And meanwhile, we had all kinds of consumers around the world of our food that, all of a sudden couldn't compete with the price that fuel companies were willing to pay. So there's this really weird dilemma about mobility versus survival, and I think this is one of the dilemmas that we'll continue to see kind of unfold. Another one having to do with product life and the fact, kind of desirability or kind of fetishization of the new thing, right? And I'm just as guilty of it as anyone. And this idea that doesn't exist, right? We kind of block that out. We block out the fact that the thing has a life after we get rid of it. And obviously, many cultures and companies have grown wiser to this and are trying to take advantage of those resources. So, another kind of opposition, and this is scientists would immediately criticize me for comparing these two graphs that really have nothing to do with each other, but I'm doing it for a conceptual reason. So we have Hubbert's bell curve on the left. He's a famous geophysicist in this country and predicted U.S. peak oil and also made some predictions about global peak oil. So it's the peak utilization of the resource. This is the low-hanging fruit. After that, it's harder and harder to extract, etc. So I don't want you just to think about oil. I want you to think about any kind of non-renewable resource. Then we have Moore's Law, which you know what Moore's Law is. But I don't want to talk just about kind of acceleration of microprocessor calculation time, but really more about kind of aspiration or trajectory of technology that has to do with distribution, miniaturization, many aspects of technology that we come to sort of accept, just accelerates. I think there's something in, again, these aren't these can't be graphed in the same graph. But I think there's something in the kind of dialogue between these lines, between these forms of kind of non-renewable resource, a physical thing that we have to manage versus the ambitions of technology. Now I know this is not true science, but I think there's something in the kind of dialogue between these trajectories, if you will, that we'll be grappling with a lot in the next 100 years. So now what I'd like to talk about is, so what are these new materials and how do we make sense of them? I'll talk more about the technologies themselves and their potential, but of course what I'd like you to do is think about how might they be used in architecture, and not just because technology is some kind of panacea for environmental or social ill, but rather because some of these may be in our palette tomorrow. And we need to really think about and assess what they mean, what kind of deeper meanings might lie within or be embodied within these materials. And what I'd like to do is, I'm trying to frame new materials in these kind of easy to understand categories or trajectories. So the first is fairly easy. It has to do with renewable energy technologies. But more specifically, these are technologies that would directly affect building design, right? It's one thing to say, for example, look at this. This is a wind harnessing curtain, for example. It's one thing to say, we'll just build a wind turbine out in the hinterland. There's an article recently in the Times about a neighborhood upset because a resident wanted to install a small wind turbine in their yard. We have a lot of this, but see, a lot of that technology, or putting solar PV panels on the roof, right? A lot of these things are applique. But I think what's interesting is more of the integrated side. So this fronts a parking garage in downtown Nagoya, Japan. What's nice about it is the vertically active wind turbines are always constantly kind of moving. They're not as effective in that environment, although it's a kind of windy corridor. They're not as effective, arguably, as they would be, hundreds of feet up in the air in the countryside. But they do power all the lighting, the indoor lighting, and the retail market behind the building, and give an interesting facade to the parking garage. We have some other examples. A lot of these have to do with solar. So the Grove, for example, they're new sort of leaves that also have piezoelectric devices that capture wind energy when the leaves flutter. Kyosendi makes Stellar, which it's like small spheres of photovoltaic material that absorb light in all directions and then bounce light. And as you can see, can be incorporated into flexible and curved substrates. You probably saw this in the middle there, the project in Beijing. Supposed to be the world's first zero energy media facade, something like that. But the interesting thing is that all the power to generate the lighting here is absorbed by these photovoltaic cells. When we begin to incorporate energy harvesting technologies in skins, we find that we can do some interesting things that make a lot of practical sense. For example, in order to reduce solar glare, you might often employ fridding, ceramic fridding in windows or other devices to shade. But what if this so-called fridding actually absorbs light and harnesses that light as energy? This technology has a long way to go. I just thought I'd include it for fun. Tokyo, a couple of the stations in Tokyo tried to install piezoelectric sensors in the turnstiles to generate energy. I think the problem is they're really delicate, but power generating floors, look, they're all going to become kind of like, it's like Prius thinking, like how can we get energy from every source? The other interesting thing is just thinking about lighting in a new way. There are many times we find ourselves in enclosed rooms without access to natural light when it's free and it's outside, and yet we turn on lights and they have heating loads and require energy on their own. So there are a lot of new materials and systems that take advantage of the opportunity of natural light. This is a 3D system called Aerodynamic, which delivers light via fiber optic cables. There are also some that use mirror-clad ducts that operate just like, they look like ductwork from the outside. So they can drive light as far as 60 feet into the interior of the building. Another similar one, these are actually point source lights that have aluminum troughs. They're highly reflective. So again, trying to maximize efficiency of light. We also have this Cititile made product. Uses light pipes at a very small scale. These are PMMA tubes that deliver light even sort of into shadow just by stretching the light along their length. Probably remember when you first saw this one of my colleagues asked, but is light transmitting concrete anymore? And I think this is interesting, is this notion of material, kind of cultural associations with materials and material readings, right? We think about concrete. Concrete means something more than just a substance, right? That's abstract, that's concrete. And so I think one thing we're seeing now is we're seeing materials begin to shift in terms of how we might measure their performance, but also how they are used in buildings in such a way that they extend their boundaries, let's say. Another one. I love this one. This is transparent ceramics, which may one day replace glass. They're much higher strength, fire resistance, etc. So speaking about light and sorry about that. Okay. I think we're fine. Speaking about light, the other thing, again, it's an energy-saving measure potentially, but the incorporation of electroluminescent materials, photoluminescence, can allow materials not only to act as you see here. I'm not sure, Kurt, should we turn down the volume a little bit? As you see here, for safety, where you have things like light clips and terrazzo, which has these, under normal conditions, hidden kind of signage, let's say for egress. Thank you. But also, this idea of materials having multiple readings under different lighting conditions is really intriguing. So that, and this is just a simple pattern, but thinking about materials that absorb energy, so they're somewhat active participants, let's say, in terms of, or at least more, they have more of a kind of dynamic quality than we're just thinking about materials having in that regard, having the potential to provide different types of readings in different lighting conditions. This is a really interesting trend for those of you who've read Jenny Dennis's book, Biomimicry. There's been a lot of excitement and popularity around this topic, and you've probably heard of laboratories looking at trying to emulate natural solutions rather than manufacturing products the way that we've manufactured them for a while, using quote unquote heat beat and treat methods. So lots of energy required, lots of pressure, chemicals to make products, which is true. A lot of the things we use are cooked, so to speak. Why couldn't we adopt some natural principles using biochemical processes? Why can't we grow materials? So for example, some of these examples are the natural sources, but biosteel is a type of really strong fabric and textile that attempt to emulate spider dragonfly silk. We have plastic steel, actually just came out of the University of Michigan, is attempting to synthesize the kind of microscopic brick-like building blocks that you see in Maker. We have all kinds of new foam technologies. This was interesting. Morphotex is a kind of structured color. So if you think about butterfly wings, you think about kind of structural color that you see in nature. It exists without paint, right? It has to do with the way that light hits the surface and the angle at which you see it. So imagine if we could design buildings or surfaces without requiring paint. And that's a new technology in the way. Or imagine if we could, there's a material called carbon coat, which uses this repositionable adhesive of small, it's almost, I think it's kind of like Velcro, but a much much more microscopic level to hold up even the weight of a small car. And on that note, there are new materials. They're not that sophisticated yet, but there are new materials that take advantage of this thinking of less embodied energy, right? We have less embodied energy, we have fewer carbon emissions, generally speaking, and there are other benefits that come with it. So there's some interesting new developments. So this one is an insulation. It's called Mycobond. There's another version called Mycoply. And myco does come from mycological. So this is an insulation type product that is made from fungus and some other agrofiber residue. But what I think is interesting is we try to keep fungus out of our wall cavity, right? But most people do. So there are now materials that begin to defy that kind of logic. There are other types of new cement and wallboards that take advantage of magnesium oxide and other types of chemical compounds so that they set up without requiring large amounts of energy input. Or you could, as this furniture manufacturer did, go find an invasive species, an undesirable and invasive species of plant. This was water hyacinth in Florida. No one wanted it. It was killing all the local, I think it was killing off fish and other wildlife. And they simply harvested it and made furniture out of it. Or this guy in Japan, Yoshioka, who's now building furniture out of crystals. So I think there's, I don't really think, he has a chair-sized version of this that I've never tried to sit in. But, so it's not quite there yet. But I think there's some interesting developments that have to do with growing materials. Oh, and this title, From Aid to Born, this refers to a book. Actually, I was exposed to this here for the first time by John Experian, but it's Kevin Kelly's Out of Control. And his thesis, although it's not outdated, but it's been around for a while now, has to do with the convergence of biological and mechanical worlds and kind of blurring of those things. So it's the idea for manufacturing to growing. And on that note, we're also seeing kind of another side of energy reduction take root and resource reduction in terms of hydrocarbon to carbohydrate in this case. So a lot of new plastics, you're familiar with bioplastics, you probably use them more than you realize. Polylactic acid-based plastics have become actually more common in just grocery store packaging. You probably don't realize that they've replaced conventional petroleum-based plastics as much as they have. But also some really interesting things, this whole notion of biodegradation, how we might engineer into materials a kind of timeline. Imagine that kind of programming, right? It's not only spatial, but it's also temporal programming for those materials that you want to degrade safely and become even food for future plants. And also, bioplastics aren't used exclusively for sort of crude packing materials and those kinds of things. We see some pretty sophisticated technologies coming out of AC that also have shape memory potential. I don't know why this mic's doing this way. And even cell phones made out of bioplastic and really interesting vehicles. So the other thing we have to think, these are all about energy, or to a large extent about energy. Something else we need to think about, obviously, has to do with distribution and transportation. And an intriguing phenomenon relates to the extent to which companies are beginning to look at their supply chains and offloading a lot of we're going from a kind of central model to a distributed model. But the problem always for companies has been had to do with concern about craft at the other end, right? And the ability to have certain supplies at the other end and kind of loss of control. But new digital fabrication methods, for one, are supplying some answers to this quandary, simply because craft can be maintained, the theory goes, and oftentimes it does work, at that other end. Like Neil Gershenfeld's Fab Labs, a lot of digital fabrication stuff I don't have to talk about in the formal manipulations of objects. Also, I should mention too, the DIY movement has become very popular, the design it yourself, and this idea of making, employing the user as a client, and making surfaces, being a participant and making a space, and also resources. The Open Architecture Network and others are looking at, they're trying to become much smarter in terms of local resource use in order, I'm trying to do this thing, in order to be smarter where the building is built or where the project is about materials so that we don't have as much of this distribution problem or emphasis placed on transporting goods. This is old news by now, but it's interesting to see how recycling and reusing materials have really changed over the years. It used to be just kind of cruddy, brown, stuff, type board-like products or inferior office paper, and that was what was recycled. And now we see a whole new composition or an amalgamation of new offerings. So. And they range in terms of the materiality and color and also function. And an interesting thing too, for those of you who probably all heard this phrase downcycling, there's concern with any time you recycle a material or product, there's a concern about the fiber shortening and that material being less valuable the more times it's recycled. But in many cases, for example, this one, freeforms 100%. You can see this kind of washed out countertop here. This is comprised by 100% of discarded household containers, detergent bottles, etc. And the interesting thing is, although this material might be downcycled in terms of its chemical composition, it's effectively upcycled, functional upcycling, insofar as something that might be used for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks at most, then can have a second life that's much longer. So I think, and obviously we need to design for dismantling too, and disassembly, think about that as well. But it's interesting that there's this kind of functional upcycling that we might be able to take advantage of. Metal shavings reincorporated into phenolic countertops. Glass is this kind of shocked me when I first learned. Glass is typically wasted on a job site. Why is that? It's because, and especially big commercial sites, it's because contractors want to order more because it takes longer. In case glass always breaks on the job site, some percentage breaks. And when that happens, there isn't the time to order new glass. So excess glass is almost always ordered. And guess what happens at the end? It's dumped. So a lot of companies are looking at recycling it. You see a lot of new concrete materials that are prefabricated or precast use waste glass. This one uses, I think, 70% of its of the material is waste glass. And it can obviously be made. These are windshields from China that have been reincorporated into these decorative panels. This is an interesting one. This is carpet that has basically been heat treated for a second life as a tile. Which is kind of strange, but interesting. And then rubber, plastics, even wood that uses waste products from the sugar industry to make a longer lasting car. So I think we see a lot of interesting second lives or reuse of materials. We can also be really smart about how long materials last or how they perform in their first lives. In this case, looking at uber materials or super materials that for, again, tracing the technological trajectory, seeing increased strength to weight ratios, carbon fiber, we have new fabric composites that operate at this really high level. Concrete, this is a concrete that's glass fiber reinforced that set in such a way that it does not require steel reinforcing. and there are benefits of that. New fibers that are stronger than steel, ductiles, and really high strength concrete. Also protection with glass that's increasingly fire retardant, other types of devices to protect against, or to insulate or protect against damage. And we also see materials used in a way that exploits dimensionality or kind of dimensional possibilities. You get interesting patterns and textures, but in a lot of these examples, the dimensionality comes as a product of trying to create a material that is structurally superior just due to the way that it's formed. Right? You're familiar with corrugated metal, for example, and how, and this is obvious stuff. But I think what's interesting is we probably don't exploit this enough in our designs. The idea, it's kind of intersection between structural performance and capacity just through form and the material itself. Because this obviously has formal implications, but also this sheet of aluminum, for example, the same amount of material would immediately oil can and bend if it were flat, just for example. And there's some other decorative treatments, foamed metals, contoured or sort of ridged or edged glass. We also have some, many other corrugated or profile materials. And again, the idea is if you can make it lighter weight, so you can use less material. We see an increasing number of hybrids, so composites of one or more dissimilar materials in which the whole of the kind of product is greater than the sum of the parts. And a lot of these are for structural performance reasons, such as this isogrid, exogrid. You're bringing different alloys together to perform in a superior way. Carbon fiber, syntactic foams. This microtruss is a ballistic resistant shield material that's made. The name is appropriate. It's like a microtruss. And this is interesting too. If you're familiar with this, the panelite material. This one's interesting. Carbon cast uses carbon fiber reinforcing instead of steel. And why that's important is not only because this panel can perform structurally has a higher performance value, let's say, than typical steel reinforced concrete, but because the carbon fiber doesn't have the conductive qualities that steel does, that this panel, compared, let's say, the same structural performance, compare steel reinforced concrete to this one, this panel can be 25% the width simply because you don't need all that coverage on the steel reinforcing. Well, in addition to this thickness is also slimmer. So this is still just precast, but it's an interesting slimming materials through this kind of hybrid pairing. Another interesting and related topic has to do with materials that accept the fact that buildings move and there are dynamic forces constantly acting on buildings, and they're not static as we commonly think of them. Although obviously you need the right project to use these, but this, I remember being pretty shocked when I first saw this because concrete sounds and right. This was developed at the University of Michigan and is now in use in shear resistant panels in some high-rise housing towns in Tokyo. We have shape memory composites that can obviously expand and contract for things like deployable. This is in a prototype stage now. The thinking is this composite, this shape memory textile used for deployable relief housing structures or mobile applications. Fabrics that, this is a blast resistant fabric which can absorb a blast multiple times. We have other types of retaining wall systems that just through their geometry are able to absorb impact through the whole system. So there's this idea of, and this is some of Obermann's kind of moving stuff, but there's this idea of structures and surfaces that are designed to move. They're designed at kind of this higher level, rather than just kind of placing expansion joints in buildings. Really interesting trend, too, is about environmental remediation. So materials operating, again, at this other level, in this case, with regard to pollution. So I know that you've heard about this cement made by Potentialities, used in Myers Church at the Vatican, and this has titanium dioxide, so it photocatalyzes pollution. And the manufacturer claims that 15% of surfaces, they use Milan, that's where they're based, 15 of the surfaces in Milan were covered with this concrete that it would reduce the pollution by half. So it's just a photocatalytic process that's activated with sunlight. And this field office has proposed a highway barrier replacement using this technology in order to absorb not only noise and light pollution, as highway barriers do, but also the pollution from the automobiles, the air pollution. We have some others. Cement absorbs carbon dioxide. We have Aerodynamic is a Japanese paint made out of natural water fiber. Again, does the same thing. It's promoted for use with people who have pets and smokers in the families. It photocatalyzes the pollutants. And you also have self-cleaning paints, self-cleaning glass, etc. Incidentally, I kind of want to design a project one time that intentionally absorbs all this stuff. Which maybe is a counterpoint to this. It's intended to get really dirty. And then that way we actually know how much pollution is. You know about this. The computers have an incredible effect on the craft of architecture and the making of architecture. And it still remains to be seen. It's a work in progress to see how this, the use of this tool unfolds. Early examples are what I call the Photoshop effect, kind of like manifestations of the screen. It's like taking whatever you're doing in Photoshop and directly applying it to materials, whether it's an external cladding system or corrugated wood products, or even creating contours and glazed materials or photo etching in concrete. We've seen a lot of these examples. This is Hitoshi Abe's Aobate restaurant in Sendai, which emulates the Zelkova trees just outside the restaurant. So this kind of model punching through the steel. But I think some other interesting things are happening, clearly, and this is some of Mary Oxford's work looking at, with MIT, looking at materials not only to kind of replicate what we can design and machine and kind of apply, but thinking about how we can create these structurally intelligent composites. So this monochrome artifact, if you will, is created by a couple of different materials. So the structure, I mean, you can see this, but the structure is effectively the same or integrated with skin itself. And the materiality actually changes across this cross-section. So the idea is to be much more intelligent about actual performance about materials and what we can create with the machine. And obviously related to the use of computers or computation within the physical environment is this interesting trend of increased interactivity, right? But also diagnostic ability of materials. So this firm called The Living in New York has these small probes, for example, that can be deployed in urban waterways to immediately communicate the water quality. So what's interesting about this is the current method is to have a water research lab come to the body of water and sample it and go away for a couple of weeks and assess. But using really simple photovoltaic and LED technologies and sampling technologies, I think we'll see more and more of this type of distributed technology that gives us feedback. It's kind of feedback loop to tell us what's happening. We also have all kinds of new interactive screens and devices. A lot of them are sort of for entertainment purposes or concrete that allows telling of time. Window systems that allow kind of programmatic shift between billboard signage and retail transparency, just based on kind of integration of this system here. And on this note, reactivity and dynamic qualities, a lot of the materials that begin to play a role. So there's smart materials or systems that begin to operate autonomously or semi-autonomously. I often wonder if the researchers at the Beckman Institute who developed this self-healing polymer, for example, chose red because that was actually the best color to use in this case, or for the obvious reading of it. But new plastics that have microcapsules of healing agent that are released when a fissure is detected. This might give a new reading to sustainable buildings if we can use self-healing materials, for example. This firm, Validity, has also devised kind of gill-like surface that begins to move in the presence of unhealthy levels of unhealthy mixes in the air, in this case of carbon dioxide. And so it's not only sort of telling us about the state of the environment, but also beginning to kind of take part. Like this system called Sonomorph is developed to react to sound, to localized sound. The idea is to emulate nature in the case of the phenomenon of tropism, in this case, to create materials and systems that begin to actively kind of take part in our textual environment. Another one is active protection system, which is a fabric. It's a textile that remains supple under normal wear conditions. This is worn by athletes. Also, I think there's some military clothing made out of this. But upon impact, the fabric immediately becomes taut. So again, it's one way in which materials can have this deeper kind of embedded intelligence and preparedness for unknown circumstances. Okay, it's a lot of stuff that I'm throwing at you. What do we do with this stuff? What are some of the opportunities? And these are again, this is kind of, I focused in on the detail there, but I'm trying to expand more broadly. This is a chart from the UN, and it charts ecological footprint, basically our environmental footprint. And these are a number of different nations that you can read this. So this is the Human Development Index, which charts a whole number of things, like birth rate, literacy, et cetera. But it basically has to do with quality of life, if we're to take that for what it is. Okay, so you can see that we're here. So this is a great place to be in terms of the Human Development Index rank, but it's really not a great place to be here. So what we want to do is we want to pull this down effectively to be closer to Japan and Ireland or Argentina. And again, this is just one chart. It's one way of looking at things, and I know it's debatable. But I think that insofar as we can, and I know we can do this, insofar as we can really look for ways to optimize the resources that we have when we can confront this problem. Here's another one that I talk about. A lot of this kind of green design movement has proliferated a whole set of new design alternatives that I've seen these published, and they're still primarily tabula rasa. It's like we've got our windmill, we've got all, and it's all on a greenfield site. But my hunch is, despite all this kind of thinking about new systems, new technologies, I don't think our emphasis in the coming years will be primarily on ground-up tabula rasa type building. I think our emphasis is going to be increasingly on this thing that we've already built, meaning the artifact of the city, the physical environment, not just the city, but the physical environment that we have today. Why? Because there's an incredible amount of embodied energy that exists in that city now. And so I think that while adaptive reuse has not always had the most glamorous air about it, especially in schools of architecture where we want to create new things, this, I think, is a lot of our project in the coming years. There's just too much already there. Despite all the volumetric projections that the Beckman Institute and others have suggested, that we're going to build again, half again, as much volume as currently exists in the next generation, I think a lot of it is going to be adaptively retooling what we have. And I think there's actually a great creative project there. I don't think it's a problem. Okay. This is another project you can look forward to. It hasn't really happened quite yet. It's starting to happen in Europe, in some cities here. If there's one thing we've added to this planet, actually become a participant, much like living the forest or anything that harnesses energy and grows autonomously based on that energy and recycles its minerals, etc. Why can't buildings become part of that? So I think what you'll find is an increased interest in the skin, not just as a separator between the environment and us when we're inside, but also as an incredible new resource to actually be utilized. And the other thing is, a lot of these buildings, a lot of 70s era corporate office buildings, they have to be reclad anyway because eventually they won't be economically viable, right? The owners are going to pay much more, but our people renting much more in terms of energy efficiency. And clients will have demands to reclad a lot of buildings. So this might be a project in the future. Another project is thinking more, this is more of a theoretical notion, but thinking more about this idea that Kelly and others, that's Kevin Kelly, and others launched more than a decade ago about the kind of convergence of the made and the born. We've seen this, it's like mechanical systems we're looking at nature to become, to sort of learn from its intelligence, and we're seeing biology becoming increasingly kind of augmented and enhanced and manipulated. So what does that mean? What can we learn from nature? What will our materials look like? How can we take advantage of this trend? And what kinds of lessons can we learn? This is a qualitative graph. This is by Aerodynamic, but it's not quantitative. So you look over time here, there's really no, this isn't trying to depict quantities of materials under scrutiny, but really rather the kind of balance of different material families, if you will, that are being investigated. So you can see here in the 60s, metals were pretty popular. I'm intrigued by the fact that these are kind of evening out. I think if we were able to see the full range of manufacturers' offerings, I guarantee you look at catalogs today, material catalogs today, they've changed more recently than they ever have. Because of USGBC and LEED, but also because designers want new and interesting things. This is a massive retooling effort that's been happening recently. And there are very few, no stone is being left unturned. Like every product's being scrutinized now for screening potential, whether bad or good, whether products or companies are simply trying to sort of re-engineer just a little bit to sell the product. But it's happening. It's really kind of enticing and interesting idea. Another one, we have to think about, I took this global flattening. I took this phrase from Tom Friedman, his World is Flat, and also the recent Hot Flat books. But this idea that we have this incredibly new and diverse and increasingly active workforce around the globe that's accelerating. And it's really exciting, but at the same time, it brings new competitiveness, right, with the industries in our country and other countries, but it brings this incredible capacity for new types of diversity and really dialing into this nature of humanity as a resource and trying to sort of celebrate that. And I think this is a social issue, obviously, as much as it is a technological one, that we should really think about and embrace. So, this is my last slide. And sorry, it's been a long-winded, a lot of information, but on that note of human potential, I've found, and this is stating the obvious, but I've found in my few years doing research into materials, and people ask me, what's your favorite new material, or what are your top 5 most interesting materials? It's really not, my interest isn't so much in any one material, but rather all these incredible people that I've been able to come in contact with, who design, produce, and install materials, and every day they deal with a lot of the challenges that I've discussed, but also the opportunities inherent in them. And it's a really compelling thing just to see the human ingenuity at work, even despite the challenges recently, the economic downturn. Clearly, despite there's a lot of greenwash out there, but there are a lot of people trying to do important things environmentally as well. And I think it's really important. In closing here, I'd like to say it is enticing. I've been enticed by a lot of this new technology, and just because of its potential, its kind of inherent potential, we can do so much with it. I've also been overwhelmed by what a lot of this new technology affords us. Because it's like your palettes grow exponentially bigger, it seems to me, than when I first started practicing. However, we shouldn't simply take this technology at face value. We shouldn't simply start using it just for aesthetic effect, let's say. But now more than ever, we have to think, right? We have to think, what are the long-term implications of these things? Just like we do when we are required to fill out a green checklist, let's say. We can't just check boxes. We can't just say, hey, we have that new thing. We actually have to think. So that's kind of part of my prologue is to entice you all to think about not only new technologies. It's kind of easy or direct way of thinking that new technologies can replace the old ones and it's the new, better iPhone kind of mentality, right? But rather, think about what are the social implications, what are the theoretical implications. I'm a little distraught, actually, that with all this new attention to materials, that materiality still, to me, still remains captured a little too much. Probably not here, actually, because there's been a lot of interesting work out of Bryce, which is great, recently. But a lot of institutions, it seems to remain kind of locked in that technology sequence. And I don't perceive a lot of the history theory faculty and other institutions, and I don't really perceive materials being considered at all these different levels that materiality should be considered. And I think it really has to be, especially when we have the challenges that we face today and the opportunities that could happen. We simply have to, it's yet another demand on our time, but I think we have to kind of think through the logic. What are the social implications, the cultural implications or qualities that certain materials have? How can we shift that to advance the project of architecture? So having said that, I have every confidence that all of you, and hopefully the profession or discipline or art, craft, whatever you want to say, of architecture that you've entered into, will be able to realize, using the technologies that you have, facing the challenges that you have, a more creative, more thought-provoking, and more responsible future